The moment the homeowner pulled into the driveway, they felt a wave of relief. The move had been exhausting, but it was finally over. A fresh start, a new home, and a quiet neighborhood, exactly what they had hoped for. As they stood outside, stretching after unloading boxes, a voice cut through the air like nails on a chalkboard. "You must be the new resident." Turning around, they were met with the sight of a middle-aged woman marching towards them, a clipboard clutched in her manicured hands. Her sunglasses sat perched high on her nose, and the sharp way she looked them up and down made it clear she was not here to offer a warm welcome. "I'm Debbie, the president of the HOA," she announced, her tone laced with forced politeness. "We have rules here. I assume you've read the handbook?" The homeowner had skimmed it. Nothing out of the ordinary, just standard neighborhood regulations. But before they could respond, Debbie was already shaking her head in mock disappointment. "Your moving truck blocked the street for 2 whole hours this morning. That's a violation." The homeowner blinked. "I had to unload my stuff somehow." Debbie waved a dismissive hand. "That's not my problem. You'll receive a formal warning." At first, they thought she was joking. She wasn't. The next morning, a bright orange violation notice was taped to the front door. That was just the beginning. Within days, the homeowner realized that Debbie wasn't just enforcing rules. She was on a power trip, and they were her latest target. Every morning, she patrolled the neighborhood like a self-appointed sheriff, searching for anything she could use against them. One day, she knocked on the door, insisting that their trash bins had been left out 2 minutes past the designated pickup time. Violation. The next, she stood in their yard, actually measuring the grass with a ruler. "HOA regulations require uniform lawn length," she declared, scribbling furiously on her clipboard. When the homeowner pointed out that their lawn was the exact same length as hers, Debbie simply scoffed and stormed off. It was getting ridiculous. Then came the breaking point. The homeowner had just finished setting up a small patio umbrella in the backyard when Debbie stormed over, her face red with barely contained rage. "You can't have that," she screeched. "It's not an approved exterior modification." They frowned. "It's an umbrella." Debbie jabbed a finger at the house. "You're a renter. You don't have the right to make changes to this property." And that's when it hit them. Debbie thought they were renting, and she thought she had the power to evict them. The homeowner folded their arms. "Oh, and what exactly do you plan to do about it?" Debbie smirked. "The HOA can petition to have problem tenants removed. I'll be filing the paperwork this week." They had to bite their tongue to keep from laughing. Because what Debbie didn't know was that the very morning she was planning her grand eviction scheme, they had just finalized the purchase of the house she was living in, and soon she was going to find out. The next morning, the homeowner stepped outside to grab their mail, only to find yet another violation notice taped to their door. This time, the offense? Unauthorized foot traffic. They frowned. Foot traffic? Debbie, who had been standing across the street watching, smirked. "Visitors must be pre-approved by the HOA. Your friends have been coming over too often." The homeowner stared at her, baffled. "You're telling me I need permission to have people visit my own house?" Debbie nodded as if she was explaining something obvious. "The rules exist for a reason. If you don't comply, I'll have no choice but to escalate things." The homeowner had to admit, her commitment to this absurdity was almost impressive. The end of the day, 2 more notices appeared. One for unapproved garden modifications, which referred to 2 small potted plants by the door, and another for excessive porch lighting, despite her having the exact same light fixture. It was clear now. Debbie wasn't enforcing rules. She was making them up as she went along. 2 days later, the homeowner returned from the gym to find something new taped to their door. But this time, it wasn't just another petty violation. It was a formal petition. Request for removal of problem tenant due to multiple HOA violations. They skimmed through it, shaking their head in disbelief. Debbie had actually gone door to door, trying to get neighbors to sign. And how many signatures had she gathered? 2. Hers, and some poor old man's, who probably thought he was signing up for a newspaper subscription. The best part? The petition was completely invalid. Only homeowners had the right to vote on tenant removals, and Debbie wasn't a homeowner. The homeowner nearly laughed out loud. It was time to end this. The next morning, they walked over to Debbie's house with an envelope of their own. Knocking. On the door, they waited as she opened it, her expression already smug. "Oh, it's you," she said, crossing her arms. "Come to accept that you don't belong here?" The homeowner smiled. "Not exactly. Since you're so concerned about tenants being removed, I figured you should be the first to know." They handed her the envelope. Debbie frowned, snatching it from their hands. "What is this?" The homeowner gestured toward the house. "Your new rental agreement?" Her face twisted in confusion. "My what?" They shrugged. "Karen, I own this property. Now I bought it last week, which means you are my tenant." For the first time, Debbie was speechless. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. That's impossible. I have a lease." The homeowner nodded. "Yep, a lease that I now control. And since you're so concerned about problem tenants, I'd suggest you start following the rules you love so much." Debbie's face drained of color. She had spent years terrorizing the neighborhood, and now the very person she had tried to evict was her landlord. For the first time in her life, Debbie had nothing to say. She stood frozen, gripping the lease agreement as if it might burst into flames in her hands. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The smug arrogance that usually radiated from her was gone, replaced by sheer disbelief. "You're lying," she finally managed to stammer. The homeowner smiled. "Nope, bought it last week, signed the papers myself, and that means you, Debbie, are now my tenant." She blinked rapidly, her mind racing. This isn't legal. You can't raise my rent, I have rights." "Oh, don't worry," the homeowner said, crossing their arms. "Your lease terms stay the same, for now, but since you love following the HOA rules so much, I expect you to set the perfect example." Her face twitched. "And," they added, "since I control your lease, you should know, any further HOA complaints about me, well, that might be considered harassment, and I'd hate to have to file a complaint of my own." The horror in Debbie's eyes was priceless. But, true to form, Debbie refused to accept reality. Over the next few days, she doubled down. She still patrolled the neighborhood like a self-proclaimed sheriff. Still slapped petty violation notices on doors. Still tried to enforce imaginary rules. Except now, there was one major difference. The homeowner ignored her. Every morning, Debbie would march up to their house and tape yet another violation to the door. And every morning, they would peel it off, crumple it up, and toss it in the trash right in front of her. Her frustration grew. She needed to find a way to get rid of them. And that's when she made her next mistake. The homeowner knew. Debbie was plotting something when she suddenly stopped handing out notices. For 2 days, there was silence. No clipboard-wielding power trips. No complaints about foot traffic or unapproved potted plants. Something was up. Then, on the 3rd day, the truth arrived in the form of a letter from the HOA board. Debbie had officially filed a grievance complaint against them, listing every fabricated violation she could think of. Her goal? To pressure the HOA into forcing them out. What she didn't know was that the homeowner had already been one step ahead. The moment they suspected Debbie would try this, they had gathered their own documentation, every bogus violation notice, every recorded conversation, and every absurd demand she had made. And now, it was time to expose her. That evening, they made a call to the HOA board. "Hey," they said, their voice calm but firm. "I wanted to discuss Debbie's recent complaint and also report some of her own violations." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Her violations?" The homeowner smiled. "Yes. You see, I've gathered quite a bit of evidence showing that Debbie has been abusing her position, not just against me but against the entire neighborhood, and I think you'll find it very interesting." The board was all ears, because as it turned out, Debbie had been breaking HOA rules for years, and now her reign of terror was about to come crashing down. Debbie strutted into the next HOA meeting with her usual air of superiority, fully expecting to be praised for keeping the community in order. She had spent years running the neighborhood like a personal kingdom, and as far as she was concerned, tonight would be no different. She took her usual seat near the front, her clipboard resting in her lap like a badge of honor. The moment the meeting was called to order, she was the first to speak. "I would like to address a major problem in our neighborhood," she announced, standing up with theatrical flair. "A certain resident, one who refuses to follow the rules, has been causing continuous disruption." She didn't bother saying their name. Everyone knew who she was talking about. "I have personally documented multiple violations, including unapproved modifications, excessive visitors, and general disregard for our community standards." She turned toward the board members expectantly. "I believe immediate action should be taken." For a moment there was silence. Then the HOA president cleared his throat. "Actually, Debbie, we have something to discuss with you." Debbie blinked. "We received another report about you." A murmur swept through the room. The homeowner, seated in the back, leaned back in their chair, smiling. The president continued. "We've reviewed multiple complaints regarding your actions as self-appointed enforcer of HOA regulations, and after careful examination, we've found that many of these violations were either exaggerated, fabricated, or enforced unfairly." Debbie's face twitched. "That's ridiculous. I have done nothing but uphold the community standards." The president didn't flinch. "Then perhaps you can explain why you were issuing fines for potted plants, or why you attempted to evict a homeowner despite having no authority to do so." The murmurs grew louder. Several neighbors began nodding, some even crossing their arms. In frustration, and then, one by one, they stood up. "She fined me for using the wrong color mulch," one man exclaimed. "She threatened to report me for putting up Halloween decorations," another neighbor added. "She told me my fence was 2 inches too high," someone else called out. Debbie's smug confidence began to crumble. For the first time, she realized she was losing control. When the dust settled, the board delivered their final decision. Effective immediately, Debbie was stripped of any and all authority within the HOA. She could no longer issue fines, no longer enforce rules, no longer act as the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood. And if she continued her antics, she would face legal consequences. The color drained from her face. This wasn't just a warning. This was the end of her reign. And yet, Debbie wasn't done yet. Because if she couldn't control the neighborhood, she had one last desperate plan. She was going to break her lease, and she thought she could get away with it. She was wrong. Debbie's final act of defiance came in the form of a crumpled letter shoved into the homeowner's mailbox. "Effective immediately, I am terminating my lease. You have no right to increase my rent, and I will not be subjected to this harassment any longer." The homeowner chuckled as they read it. Debbie actually thought she could just break her lease and walk away. But legally, she had no case. That evening, they knocked on Debbie's door, lease agreement in hand. She answered with a scowl. "I have nothing to say to you." "That's fine," the homeowner said casually. "But I thought you should know that your lease is still legally binding. If you break it, you're responsible for the remainder of the rent and any damages." Debbie's smug expression faltered. You can't enforce that." The homeowner pulled out their phone. "I already spoke with a lawyer. If you move out early, I can take you to court. And trust me, Debbie, I will." For the first time, true panic flickered in her eyes. She knew she couldn't win. She had spent years using rules to control others. Now those same rules were controlling her. A week later, moving trucks arrived in front of Debbie's house. The homeowner stood on their front porch sipping coffee as she stomped back and forth, shoving boxes into the truck. She refused to look in their direction, her entire body radiating frustration. But the homeowner, they were enjoying every second. As the last box was loaded, Debbie slammed the truck door shut so hard that it rattled. "Safe travels, Debbie," The homeowner called out, raising their mug. Hope you find a neighborhood that appreciates your leadership. Debbie's entire body stiffened. She clenched her fists, her jaw tight, but she said nothing. And just like that, she was gone. A week later, the neighborhood felt different, brighter, lighter. People who once avoided stepping outside now gathered in their yards, chatting like old friends. A couple stopped the homeowner while they were out for a walk. "Thank you for standing up to her," they said. "She's been a nightmare for years." Another neighbor laughed. "You know, she once fined me for having a mailbox that was too modern." The homeowner smiled. The neighborhood was finally free, and as they looked around at the peaceful streets, they took a deep breath and enjoyed the silence. Because for the first time in years, there was no HOA tyrant watching.